Hello, and welcome to The Distillery, an online interview series. I'm your host, Harry Li Shanglun. I'm streaming from the unceded lands of the people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Today we have special guest, Ghian Tjandaputra. Ghian, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing rather swell now that we're having a donut day.
It's Double Donut Day, for those not in the know.
Double donut day.
Victoria just announced that we have 0 new cases of COVID-19 and 0 deaths from COVID-19. And I desperately hope that continues to be the case. It's been a long time coming. Are you doing anything to celebrate?
Well, I have been sort of knee deep in my work and study, so I haven't really imagined a future out of lockdown. But I imagine it would be a form of sit-in coffee. Honestly, just to sit in outside, that's probably what I'm going to do.
Very Melburnian. I only just started drinking coffee last year. I feel like I've finally become a Melburnian.
One step closer.
Yeah, exactly. And what is it that you do as your work? Because I know you're involved in a number of different things.
Sure. I manage the partnerships at the Australia-Indonesia Centre, it's an Australian government initiative that is based out of Monash, that was established to effectively bring together government, businesses, and researchers from Australia and Indonesia. And yeah, what I do specifically is I work with our different stakeholders to put together programs and make sure that our researchers can work together.
And what's the purpose broadly of connecting Australia and Indonesia?
I think Indonesia plays a sort of underrated role in Australia's future. I guess China's role is well understood, but I think what Australians don't fully appreciate yet is that countries like not just Indonesia, but countries like Indonesia and the rest of Southeast Asia, they're going to be increasingly more important in our prosperity over the next decade, because that's the countries and the region who is growing. That means more and more jobs, more and more investment, and more of a larger part of our economy is going to be inherently linked with Indonesia and the region.
It's always stunned me that despite our geographical proximity, Australia hasn't really invested as much energy into connecting with Southeast Asia broadly as it has aligned itself with Western powers. That's felt a little short-sighted.
That's right. And we've actually at the AIC we've done a survey actually on 2016 where we surveyed 2,000 Australians and 2,000 Indonesians, and from the Australian side, that is what we found, that Australians, we tend to look actually beyond the region towards China, and that interestingly, our surveys also found that Indonesians have a much better understanding of Australia and like Australia, actually, as in like have higher positive association with the country than the other way around. I guess it's because more and more Indonesians are exposed to Australia vis-a-vis the international students. Australia is the #1 market for Indonesian students overseas. It wouldn't be, and Melbourne, where we are in particular, is the top destination. So I guess it's less of a surprise, whereas the other way, the opposite trend of Australians going to Indonesia is actually getting better, but not quite at the same level as Indonesians being here.
And I feel like historically it's been like, oh, we're going to Bali for a holiday kind of situation.
Exactly. Historically, even Bali has not always been ironically associated with Indonesia. Bali has been associated as its own country, more commonly, less so now. But that whole, I guess the stereotype of Australia-Indonesia relations, that it used to be about the 3 Bs, which is a Bali, beef, and bombing, 2 decades ago. Which is like, but that's the reality. I mean, it's not just of Australians with Indonesia, but that's just the nature of the bilateral relationship historically. But I think we're getting better, though. We're getting better in terms of, being exposed to each other's cultures a bit more, and just really getting more of an understanding of each other.
And so is that the kind of function of your role? Are you trying to collide the cultures and do that kind of meet cute scenario?
Part of it, yeah. So what we mainly do is we connect researchers to do collaborative research together, but we also part of our mandate is to promote contemporary understanding of Indonesia and Australia. So one of the things we've done to do that is to organize a short film festival and competition called the Real Ozin, and where we create awards not just for filmmakers from both countries, but actually create a specific type of award for collaborative films between filmmakers from both countries. And we have shifted, like everything else, online this year. So yeah, I guess you can actually check it. We've just actually launched last week or 2 weeks ago online, and it's pretty cool. It's one of those things that you see little vignettes of, I guess, stories that I'm still learning as well about Indonesia from Australia through 3 or 4 minute, I guess, stories is pretty underrated and pretty powerful.
What's the website that we should go to check this out?
Real Ozint.
Real Ozint. Sorry, I'm just like looking at it now. That's great. I remember being part of a creative lab for Asia Topa, the Triennale of Performing Arts, and getting to meet a bunch of Indonesian artists, including Garin Nugroho, who made Setan Jawa. And it's just being, I think, blown away by all the possibility space of connecting artists from these two regions, having very rich conversations and doing that, soft power of the arts diplomacy thing. But in a social context that did feel really relevant and not just like political puppet strings, so to speak.
No, absolutely, you're right. It's through the arts, through films, and Garin Nugroho is one of the most celebrated filmmakers in Indonesia. It's through stories that and through that medium particularly is how talk about gaining understanding. I gain much more understanding out of watching a movie of a foreign film compared to listening to a diplomat or a politician making the same points, actually, telling the same stories, but I actually probably remember and appreciate it more in the form of a film. So, it served some different purposes, but that's legitimately, that's the power of culture, I think, which people don't really necessarily see, even at that diplomatic level.
Not that you're a stranger to listening into diplomats. You've been involved in several international conferences, everything from COP 15 to the G20 Youth Summit. And you've been organizing as well. Recently, I think you had local government figures in conversation between Indonesia and Australia, or even more locally between West Java and Melbourne. Can you tell us more about your involvement in that political sphere?
Sure. So as part of my role, I organize dialogues, either private briefings or really bring together leaders from both countries for a discussion with the public through the webinars. The one that you mentioned, for example, we invited the governor of West Java, which is Indonesia's largest province. I think most Australians sort of don't really remember it. They know it's big, but we don't really remember occasionally how big Indonesia is. And West Java is an example. Indonesia's largest province, West Java, is the size of South Korea, of having 50 million people. And we had it is so dense as well. You're right, and we invited him for a conversation with the Lord Mayor Sally Camp to discuss how they respectively approach the response to COVID-19.
That's really cool. And then on top of that, going back to this idea of what does cultural exchange, research exchange look like? You have also done very excitingly things in the realm of sports and community, starting a football team. What was all that about?
Yeah, so I think a few years ago, I think 2015, 2016, myself and a few friends who were also passionate about Australia-Indonesia relations and AFL saw there was an opportunity to, I guess, strengthen the community relationships of Australians and Indonesians in Australia through AFL. So we decided to start a AFL 9 or a touch footy club called the Krakatoas. and where we competed. It was very casual and fun. We compete social sport, AFL 9, but we took it pretty seriously and still are. But introducing Indonesians in Australia to AFL, which to me I think was it really allowed me a way to access Australia and to make myself more accessible to Australians. Now that I'm like a diehard footy fanatic, I'm that much more relatable to the quote unquote average Australian,
or at least the average Melburnian, given that
that's
AFL. And so, wait, did you barrack for it?
I barracked for, unfortunately, the Cats, who was soundly beaten in the last quarter by the deserving Richmond. But yeah.
Big Cats.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's it. It's really fun.
My friend recently, how many like average house cats would you have to assemble and weaponize to take on a tiger? Just curious what number you would throw out. How many house cats would you need?
I probably would need one, because like a house cat would just distract the lion to its it would distract the lion to like its demise. I don't know. And then
just like look cutely at it
and just run away and cross a road in which the cat would swiftly wiggle its way away from cars, but the lion wouldn't. So maybe one. That's all it takes.
I like that. I mean, that's true, like team optimism right there. Die hard Cats fan.
Efficiency. Yeah.
I'm really fascinated by your use of the word accessible. You said that using AFL became more accessible to Australians, and that's a really distinct contrast to what I think most people might, or at least I don't have personally an association with footy. I pretend to be a Tigers fan because someone showed me a picture of Dusty Martin once, and I think it is so interesting the markers that we take on to be more or less Australian, particularly because I don't sound very Australian. I sound more American for some reason. Did you find that you were doing that very consciously, that you were trying to, assimilate or take on the markers of? And if so, to what purpose?
It was something that I did try to appreciate consciously. I think, but the baseline for me was I'm already generally pretty obsessed about sports. I guess my main sports of obsession is football, aka soccer is what the Americans, but like football for these purposes of differentiation. So I already love sports, and I just noticed you can't escape, obviously, footy if you're in Melbourne. And it was pretty early on, probably about within 2 or 3 years of arriving here, that it was only after like my Australian friend took me to the game to find out what it was all about. And then I realized, because it's such a household conversation, socially and professionally, I think it's, to me, so I did want to get into it for that reason, knowing that it was such a household. It typically forms such an important part of household conversations, but at the same time, it's also something that's authentically me, because I love sports anyway. Once I guess I became more accessible, just simply because once I talk about footy, people don't really realize, or don't have it at least on the front of their mind, where I'm from. I think that's where typically is where I guess Asian Australians, or really anyone with a migrant background, or even non-Anglo-Celtic background, I would argue, in Australia, is if we're introducing ourselves, the first almost instinctive reaction that we sort of bring out of people is, where are you from? And so when if we just casually start a conversation about footy, just like every other person arguing why that holding the ball decision was ridiculous, then that's like, where I'm from is not the first thing that would probably come to their minds. So that's, I think, how I became more accessible, by embracing footy.
And I'm fascinated also that, this is an authentic part of self. And as people who end up connecting different cultures, and by extension, different peoples and histories and politics, I think, we end up having a multitude that we might present facets, we might use particular tricks that you could frame as survival, but actually it's all still authentic. It's still us.
Absolutely. And that is key. I think that's like finding parts of yourself that you can then relate to the culture that you're trying to connect to is, to me, the point. There is no point for me trying to, I guess, to connect myself to something that I just have no relation to. Because if I want to be relatable, then it's actually two-way. I have to relate to it in the same way that it relates back to me. So that's why finding something that's actually I do enjoy and I can relate to is actually one half of the equation.
So I feel like the work that you're doing through the Australia-Indonesia Center and this kind of discussion about coming over from Indonesia and becoming more accessible to Australians and now being a connector, somebody who can talk across Indonesia and Australia and even China, I think, in the broader discussions. How did those things connect? Did one inform your current work? It feels like a fairly clear one-to-one, but how did you get to be in the position that you are now?
I think I was pretty lucky. It was almost by chance, but at the end of the day, when I look back, it's not really by chance, because how I came to this role is really from the starting point of I see myself as an Australian Indonesian. So it would then follow that, and I do love the work of diplomacy. I did an arts degree and international studies as part of my undergrad. So I do love that space, and me seeing myself as an Australian Indonesian. So it would then follow that I would probably enjoy and embrace working at the Australia-Indonesia Center.
Just on your name on it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's great branding, really. Connecting diplomats or government leaders from two countries without actually being a diplomat myself. So, but yeah, that starting point of seeing myself as an Australian Indonesian is, I would say, how I got to where I am.
I'm really fascinated to dive into what you perceive as the broader political issues facing the Indonesian-Australian relationship today. And maybe I'll start this with a very broad question, which is, these two nations have very different self-conceptions of themselves, if that makes sense. They think of themselves in different ways. How would you characterize those differences? What do you think Indonesia sees itself as right now, and what does Australia see itself right now?
I think Indonesia, first of all, sees itself as a country with unfulfilled potential, really. Indonesia is rich in resources, and it has one of the largest populations in the world. But in terms of our relative position in the international geopolitical landscape, Indonesia probably sees itself as slightly punching below its weight. Whereas Australia is probably the reverse. We are actually, I think, to me, in my view, Australians, or at least Australian government, sees itself as having punched above its weight of, not just accepting itself as a middle power, but actually try to, I guess, for example, like Kevin Rudd, he established a G20. He was one of the founders of the G20 back in to deal with the financial fallout of 2009 crisis. So, so I guess that's probably the two differences in C. But I guess the commonalities is right now both countries are sort of in that middle power territory. So one of the key things of just like any other middle power, the key dynamic that would influence its relationship is how each country respectively deals with the China and US question. So yeah, there's a lot of common ground in that regard.
And I think it's safe to say that Australia, at least increasingly so, has taken a harsher stance in that balancing act with China, right? Where it wants certain things and continues to seek certain things from China, but is also distancing itself and even demanding, most recently, for example, Chinese Australians to declare their, condemnation of the CCP. Something mired in I think a colonial history of racism baked into Australian culture. So that's at least my perception of the Australian side of things. How about Indonesia and its ties to China?
Indonesia has, I would say, a pretty long and also slightly complicated relationship with China. But the starting point is Chinese Indonesians have probably, I'm no expert on this, but I think Chinese Indonesians have, I guess, been embedded within the Indonesian society for much longer compared to Australia, in the sense that the Chinese Indonesians are typically, they're not first or second generation Chinese Indonesians, but in fact, fifth or maybe even sixth generation.
Right. They weren't kicked out with the White Australia policy.
No, that's right. And, that's absolutely right. So, yeah, and in terms of how Indonesia deals with China now, it's, I guess, very pragmatic, in the sense that it's embracing Belt and Road Initiative to fund some of Indonesia's most strategic infrastructure projects, like the fast train between Jakarta and Bandung, and a whole other resource facilities that Australia is not embracing. But at the same time, Indonesia's foreign policy is famously a free and non-aligned. So in fact, like, Indonesia steadfastly tried to be as neutral as possible. Like, that's literally their foreign policy, is neutrality almost for the sake of neutrality. So
right, the Switzerland of the Southeast Asia region.
Yeah, exactly. Whilst it's embracing China, it's also, as a result of that neutrality foreign policy, it's also mindful of balancing its relationship with the US as well.
So here are these two middle powers punching above or below, trying to make waves in I think a rapidly changing power structure. How can these two nations, Indonesia and Australia, benefit each other best, looking 5, 10, even 50 years into the future?
That's a great question. I think, to me, the future really lies on, I guess, some of the key drivers of our economy, which to me really revolves around entrepreneurship of its two peoples. Indonesia has a thriving and growing digital economy that is not just about growing the economic pie for the sake of it, but also strive to include goals like financial inclusion. For example, in the context of Indonesia, is connecting to the unbanked population and using technology to reach the whole large sector of the informal economy. Whereas here in Australia, we're using advances in tech and medtech in particular here in Melbourne. So I think the opportunities for me lie in the entrepreneurs of both countries. The future, to me, lies in the entrepreneurs of both countries working together. And that's not just entrepreneurs working with each other, but investors investing in each other's startups. And yeah, I think if we can do, I guess one of the things we try to promote is this idea of what we call the joint competitive advantage, which is effectively, in a nutshell, a country has advantages in one area, another country has advantages in the other area. So how can two countries combine their respective advantages to create a joint advantage to a third market? So that's where Australia and Indonesia, if Australia and Indonesia can use and embrace that principle to solve problems through technology, to solve problems in the region. God knows we don't have a shortage of them. Then I think that's where the future lies.
I think it's really key in that you've highlighted entrepreneurship, but technology and digital economies, and that's really exciting. It feels like there's a number of countries which are embracing that change, and there are a number which are reluctantly being dragged towards it. I'm interested to see whether Australia will pivot quickly enough from our traditional lucky country resources in the ground model. Certainly the most recent budgets don't necessarily suggest so, but I still have my fingers crossed.
Yeah, well, I think at least at the community level, now that we're used to Zoom, we've been forced to use with Zoom and otherwise, one would hope that at least the idea of technology is no longer an alien concept after having been forced to adapt to it this particular year. So there's hope yet.
Just in terms of like zooming all the way back to ground level, I lived in Jakarta for 6 years. I grew up there from the ages of 6 to 12. And I remember feeling very technologically kind of out of joint from the rest of the world, as much as my awareness of the rest of the world existed. And at the same time, now I am like chatting with Indonesian friends, and it's like they're light years ahead. You know, there's been a huge leap since the time that I've left. Is that true from your experience, and how does that going to impact exactly what we're talking about?
Absolutely. I think that leapfrogging notion is particularly true for, I guess, emerging economies. I guess I would say the downside of having a mature economy like Australia is that the opportunities for leapfrogging tend to reduce. But to use how that example of leapfrogging China is naturally the leader in this. So to use that example of the unbanked population, this is unbanked, literally meaning people, the informal economy. This is a mom and pop who own the local milk bar. It doesn't even have to be in the region. In the city, as you know, is literally, that's just it. It's just a stall with a very minimum set of assortment, and they're serving that one.
Lima.
Exactly. Literally, they're serving that 2 kilometer or 5 kilometer radius. That's it. Then, right, and they usually don't have a bank accounts. So they can leapfrog. What they are leapfrogging by, it's not like they're following the steps of, okay, going from having no bank account to having a bank account and then into something else. They go straight, they skip that bank account step and use digital wallets instead. So this Kaki Lima or the stalls that you're talking about, like they can manage their money through the digital wallets from the country's most common Uber-like platform called Gojek or Grab, basically. And because it's a mix of Uber and Uber Eats and really every single thing you can think of. So those leapfrogging opportunities, I think, is much more rife in emerging countries like China before, and Indonesia and Southeast Asia now, which is why I think it's even more important for Australians to really pay attention on what's going on in the region, because we're actually we're kind of missing a remarkable leapfrogging story just right across the border.
I think that's a perfect summary of the things that we've been chatting about, that Australia really, from our perspective, and I include, all Australians, including Australians with multiple identities as they connect with other cultures and politics and histories and cultures, nations, need to be thinking really carefully about how we form and forge relationships for these emerging economies that are going to start overtaking us and doing amazing things in the global economy's scale. Ghian, it's been so wonderful to hear your insights on this, both the personal and the wildly abstract political stuff. Thank you for your time. It's been really generous and lovely.
Thank you so much. It's been a blast.
Awesome. Take care, and do get yourself some donuts in celebration.
I sure will.
That was Ghian Tjandaputra from the Partnership Coordinator of the Australia-Indonesia Centre. You definitely should check out their writing, which you can find online at the Australia-Indonesia Centre's website. Thanks so much for tuning in. You've been watching The Distillery, an online interview series. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. If you want to check out other episodes, check out our website, distillery.site. And you can also follow us on Twitter @DistillerySite or Instagram @distillery.site, where you can check out all the lovely faces of the exciting guests that we have. Tune in next time, and until then, take care, everyone. Bye.